and of course the extremist intellectual culture consumers that cluster around art galleries and what is left of culture are unfortunately a fairly efficient deterrent to the rest of us as well, because they all say things like, oh, but what do you mean you haven't seen frog in formaldehyde? Why, you poor little thing, you haven't lived. Just looking at that little amphibian fixed so still in that aquarium, one can feel the deepest emotions of the artist's questioning of the origins of our species. Now, for real, genuine, multi-level natural culture to thrive, it needs to be able to anchor itself in the territory, build itself around the resources that the territory offers, and it needs to be protected somewhat from outside influences, all the while maintaining full acceptance and an open mind towards other well-anchored cultures, so that we don't once again become wary and suspicious of anything not local. And now we have the technology to do that through documentaries, travel, and the free movement of people, albeit that we are aiming to slow some of that down to reduce cultural erosion. How can you possibly hope to go and discover the full depth of any culture if it hasn't been protected from overbearing, bland ideas that have somehow invaded every culture on the planet? When you come to understand that the most widespread cultural phenomena on the earth have been McDonald's, Coca-Cola, and Knight Rider, we can all agree that we might just be willing to go back to the drawing board and try again. Except maybe for Knight Rider, of course, as the talking car did at least have charm, personality, and a strong, well-aligned moral compass, even if this latter was an electronic dashboard-integrated gadget. As said earlier, those blanket decisions that we need to keep to a strict minimum in some kind of world parliament and referendum system, and don't forget, not the United Nations, as we are aiming for the removal of nations, all of these discussions and decisions should be discussed by representatives that represent no more than 50,000 people each, and also that the people that they represent must live within a clearly defined bioregion. You cannot hope to speak for people with a harmonious voice if they don't at least live in the same bioregion, because their needs cannot be the same. Again, we come back to politics as the idea of a local duty and not an international career move. Now, this will probably mean that each bioregion will need several representatives and be host to several big towns and cities. Now, I'm honestly going to plagiarise a work that's not my own at all. It is mostly taken from a book called A Pattern Language by Christopher Alexander, and indeed some of what I have already said about bioregions and representatives of 50,000 comes from this book. It is a detailed and well thought out work that is mostly about the patterns that we need to give to a town. As all living things follow natural patterns and codes, the question is, what would happen if we gave urbanized areas a simple code to follow as they expand? And the book is a total blinder and quite free and available as PDF in several languages. The aim of the book is to introduce a certain vocabulary to our senses, in the same way that if I say the word microscope, you all know that I'm talking about an apparatus with a column and a lens and some movable lenses in the middle that you can put a slide with a sample in, and you can actually get to see something that you cannot see with the naked eye. See, microscope means all of that and more, and you know what I'm talking about because you have had the idea of a microscope explained to you, you have used one, or you've seen one on the telly box. Complicated problems require complicated solutions, and once the solution is defined, we give it a name to avoid having to explain it all the time. And this is exactly what happened to me when I discovered the word permaculture. Up until then, for the last 10 years, I used to spend hours on end explaining to people how my garden and chickens worked together as a team, and how my future farm and house were going to work together, because I was going to design it all instead of just letting it happen to the landscape. Most people thought it was very interesting, but they also thought that I was more than a little cracked. Because I was so passionate about it, I could happily spend several hours at a dinner table rabbiting on about the subtleties of interlinking natural elements to make a whole, based on observations and research, just so that I would feel understood by other human beings. Now, when the word permaculture entered my life, I found suddenly, like so many other people, that it was just a natural thing to do and be, and now I actually get paid for several hours rabbiting on to groups of people about how my garden and chickens work together as a whole, and how to design farms and houses full of interlinking elements based on observations and research. Thank you, permaculture. With just one word, you turned a very big problem into a very big solution for me. So in this book, A Pattern Language, we learn lots of new words and phrases, and each phrase has a chapter explaining the meaning. Most of the explanations are then used as building blocks for the subsequent chapters. Now, I won't be going through all of it. I'm just going to sketch out a general outline so you get the idea. You can always download it or buy it and read it yourselves. Now, the first phrase that changes everything when thinking about urban development, and it's not the first one in the book, this is city, country, fingers. Now, this isn't some kind of jam, marshmallow and chocolate biscuit affair from Cadbury's either, so stop licking your lips. This is, for me, the most important and hard-hitting part of the book, and everything else builds on this. But first, before we get on to plagiarising Christopher's book, a bit of very vague history from me to explain how and why today's towns and cities are so infernally difficult to live in, because despite unconsciously grouping ourselves together in some rough resemblance of a natural pattern, our urban areas have more or less just happened to the landscape, or decisions have been made by what we can affectionately call self-interested bastards. So, clear your mind and imagine a completely empty landscape of rolling grassy hills. A nomadic family wanders across the hills. They can travel quite fast, having very few needs, just stopping to sleep and eat in a quick camp. From time to time, they decide to settle and catch up on more important stuff like washing, grooming, laundry, repairing their few but essential possessions, or just relaxing for a few days and stocking up on supplies and energy. When they do stop somewhere for a time, they set up a much more sophisticated camp where there will be plentiful resources to hand, choosing the right combination of the shelter of a cliff, hill or woodland border facing the sun, and especially not too far from a river or a stream. Settlement, even temporary settlement, requires much thought and analysis for it not to become a total nightmare. Now, as people begin to settle more and more frequently, especially where conditions are more favourable, they often meet up at these hospitable hotspots to exchange news, services and goods. These are points on the landscape where this is more intense than others. The easy crossing of a full and flowing river, or the crossing point of two well-used tracks, become points where people coagulate because the natural pattern in the movement of people makes these points places where you are quite simply more likely to run into somebody else. When something as advanced as a bridge, ferry or ford appear on the landscape, the tracks and roads leading in and out multiply quite suddenly and branch out in all directions. It becomes not only a crossing point and reference meeting point to exchange goods, but also a general hanging out point full of opportunity. If the river that the bridge spans is a nice deep one, a docking point for boats will quickly result in a spreading cobbled marketplace centred around a well of good clean water for drinking. A few warehouses will pop up out of the ground, as will somewhere to sit by the fire, eat a good meal and thrash out a trade deal over a decent tankard of ale. Obviously, the surrounding land then becomes colonised with all sorts of infrastructure to fill the basic needs of the burgeoning community. Now, once you get to that point, roads and alleyways and side streets will flourish all around, and of course, just when everybody's getting on nicely, the poxy empire and its bejeweled bingo callers turn up and claim enough stone to build the foundations of 10,000 timber frame buildings, which then gets eaten up to build an intricate energy harness commonly called a church. But empires aside, the simple working folk group themselves together by trade because there are advantages in working together. Baker Street will be well equipped with many a bread oven, good vermin-proof buildings for storing, and good easy access out back for wagons of firewood and flour. It will also be not too far away from Miller's Wharf, where the grain arrives by barge or by cart, and the water of the river turns the millstone to grind the grist. And over on Forge End there will be high furnace chimneys and a huge yard to be able to manage the movement of charcoal, iron ore and the resulting slag heaps. In a world without oil, the word competition has very little meaning indeed. People of the same trade group themselves together and share infrastructure, working together based on personal talent and niches in the humanosphere. Apprentice blacksmiths would manufacture nothing but nails, waiting for the day when they could move on up to the more demanding, interesting and exciting work. And so the towns and cities slowly ate up the countryside around them in a very haphazard way, spreading in a circular, expansive movement rather like a saw or a boil, and quickly polluting the poor river that was its origin. But this was nothing as to what would come next. As industry flourished, existing towns and cities acquired a belt of factories and housing lots, and the already postulating tumour of human habitation on the landscape grew a hard and ugly crust as the old town fenced itself inside a smoke-belching ring as it sent out tendrils of road and rail to link itself to its equally cancerous cousins, blooming all over the landscape. After a couple of big wars, the rebuilding went on even quicker, and the huge, many-laned high-speed roads would become arteries to flow goods in lorries and humans in cars from one tumour to the other. And within throwing distance of the biggest, fattiest and noisiest of these arteries, immense reinforced concrete towers would appear out of the ground, and the capacity to pile people on top of one another began. When the industrialists then found that Chinese workers and long-haul container ships combined were cheaper than local labour, Western industry apparently floundered through a whole series of fictive economic crises, and many consider that the great industrial families failed and dwindled away. But no, the derelict shells of their former factories around many cities serve today as warehousing for the goods that they now have made in China and India, especially in the textile and trainer industry. Any rarer industrial architectural masterpieces of the industrial period would get bought up and redeveloped into very nice apartments for their high-flyer descendants who deal in unities of exchange, percentages, and human suffering. Now today our towns are ringed by mega malls and shopping precincts and retail villages, all selling objects that need delivering by swarms of men in white vans, and the number of faulty objects is now so profuse that after-sales service and complaints departments are now among the highest employment sectors. To get into the town centre itself, one must take the car and navigate it through a completely blocked up road system, and then try to find somewhere to park the fucking thing, and then from there on in, everything you do will cost you money and be of dubious, if not toxic, quality. A sandwich, a drink, even going to the toilet is either an expense or an extreme displeasure, and very often both. Living or working within a town costs a fortune as well, because paradoxically, living and working space are in very high demand, and keeping either of these spaces warm requires using very non-ecological methods, and really, in towns and cities as they stand today, the them are just having it away, getting it all as they want. They advertise all their shit on any square centimetre available, the air is filthy, the food is dangerous, and every interaction is based on exchange of money, and they just have it all sewn up. Now this is because, just like the rest, political power is based solely, when you get down to it, on the allocation of money. When a government decides to build a swimming pool, there isn't a swimming pool expert in the local government who has the power delegated to him to create the swimming pool because he's really interested in the general benefit of swimming pools to the well-being of the humans that live there. No, not at all. They just allocate the money and the planning permission after a nice series of backhanders, and the swimming pool is created as a financial asset. It is the same when they decide to do a bit of ecology. They don't decide what will happen to rebalance the ecosystem. They don't have a fucking clue or give a monkey's either. They just decide how much will be invested, and then people with projects that fit within the greenwashing criteria get selected to be subventioned and get to go on and create their project.